Ukraine's military says it has shot down more than 30 objects in the latest round of Russian strikes targeting the Kyiv region overnight. Many residents of the Ukrainian capital took shelter in subway stations after air raid alerts were sounded across the country. The alerts have since been lifted. Kyiv's mayor says no calls were made to emergency services. Well, as those attacks continue, Ukraine is preparing its forces for its long-awaited counteroffensive to retake cities in the east from the Russians. To do that, troops will almost certainly have to fight street by street, house by house. Urban warfare poses some of the greatest risks to individual soldiers, as DW's Max Chanda reports.
This is one of the most dangerous moments in urban warfare. One wrong move here could be your last.
One goes inside, and then the next.
These soldiers are fresh from the front line, where they faced shelling in trenches. Instead of resting, they prepare for what may be next.
We'll have to go into Donetsk and Luhansk. We'll have to storm every building. And there will be collaborators, saboteurs, regular troops, private military groups. We'll have to drive them out of houses, not from fields.
That's why they're in this abandoned hotel. Ukrainian troops may only have one chance to take back their towns from the Russians. They can't afford mistakes.
It's very important for us to take the right approach. If we don't, and we break like them, then I'm sorry, we don't have enough people to take risks. They're ready to leave hundreds behind, near one house. We are not ready to leave a single one.
These soldiers spend 4 to 5 hours training every day. Tactics, shooting, and first aid. They know their lives may depend on it.
We tighten the tourniquet as tightly as possible, so that not only a finger, not even a feather can fit in between. Of course, he will scream, all kinds of things, that it hurts, let me go, but you absolutely can't loosen it.
Most of them will have experienced this already. Yuri himself was permanently taken out of the fight when he was injured in battle last year. His best friend died next to him. Teaching from his experience, he's trying to help these men survive. This is what they want to avoid. Ukrainian officials don't say how many soldiers die, but we're told the number of military graves here at this Kharkiv cemetery has doubled over the last 3 months. Some of the men and women buried here were as young as 20. Now, this cemetery is already the final resting place for hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers from the area. And people here believe that fighting at the front will intensify soon. Now, no matter how that will turn out for Ukraine, this will mean more funerals and more graves for soldiers here in this ground. That means more families who will turn to priest Viktor Marinchak. He knew many of those he's buried here.
I admit I cannot comfort anyone, because the loss remains with us. Because there is a grave, and there is a coffin. Because there is separation until the end of our days. But we should know that what they did, and are doing now, is full of deep meaning. Because they repeat the Savior's feat. They prevent more death through their own death.
Another family says goodbye. Andrei Alexandrovich died more than 2 months ago in an eastern forest. Today, he is finally buried with love and with military honors. He won't be the last. For Ukraine and Ukrainians, there doesn't seem to be an alternative.
We need victory. We don't need peace. If there's no victory, then there will be no peace. There will be slavery.
Defenders fear that more than death itself. And so they prepare for more sacrifice.
Earlier, I spoke with DW's Max Tanda, who filed that report. I asked him about the morale among Ukrainians after 15 months of war.
Right, Terry. So, I mean, war, if we learn one thing, then war certainly changes people. And people are tired. People here in the capital and other Ukrainian cities are tired from the overnight attacks that they've been experiencing on a regular basis now for more than a month. Soldiers are tired of fighting. If you travel the country and you talk to troops there, some are going to be a bit more upbeat about what they do, about their motivations, and others are going to tell you about the hardships, how difficult it is to do the fighting, how they rely on medication, for example, to stay calm, or even being able to go to sleep. And for a reason, right? The tasks that they have to carry out are grueling. Some have seen their comrades, friends being blown into pieces. They've been asked to storm trenches or ordered to storm trenches and kill other people. But apart from that, from talking to soldiers and civilians alike, my impression is that morale is not broken. It's still very high. It's still quite the opposite. If you go, for example, into a cafe anywhere here in the country, be it in Kiev or in Donbas region or perhaps even in Western Ukraine, close to the Polish border, and talk to people there, my estimate, my guess is you probably wouldn't find a single person who hasn't lost anyone or who doesn't know anybody who lost someone or who lost their livelihood. So the death toll, the price that Ukraine has paid so far is very, very high. And that's something that keeps people going. That's something that keeps people motivated. Also, the knowledge that if they stop resisting now, this may mean the end of Ukraine to exist as we know it.
In your report, Max, we saw how soldiers are preparing for urban warfare. How is that related to the planned counteroffensive?
Right, so probably becomes surprising to some people is that these frontline fighters spend a few days at the front and then they come back, and not just to rest, but also to train. So they go through 4 or 5 hours of training. In this case, they were focusing on the assault of a building, and we were told that this is something that they are preparing for in the near future, to fight more in cities, which could be connected to a potential counteroffensive. But then if you talk to the soldiers and ask them, or literally anyone, they will tell you they don't know exactly when and where this is going to happen. We've been talking about this since spring, since February, March, and what we can do at the moment is just pretty much to speculate. But what we know right now is, or what we can be seeing, is that the dynamic of the war is changing up a bit. We've seen overnight attacks every other night here in the capital, Kiev, and other places of Ukraine. There have been some cross-border operations by certain military groups operating across the border in Russia. There have been alleged attacks and drone attacks, for example, in Moscow and other provinces and other oblasts in Russia. So this could be indicators that something is changing, that the dynamic of this war is changing, but we certainly do not know when and where the counteroffensive will take place.
Max, thank you very much for your reporting. That was our correspondent, Max Tanda, in Kiev. For some more analysis, we're joined now by Ed Arnold. He's a security analyst and a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Thanks for being with us. Ed, Ukraine is expected to launch a counteroffensive any time now. They'll be trying to flush out Russian troops. How much of that counteroffensive do you think will involve urban warfare?
Well, it really depends how Ukraine wants to go about this offensive. It is really already started. You'll see a gradual uptick in operational tempo, which we're seeing across the front line at the moment. So it has started, but it's not an offensive that will start on a certain day and then continue. But in terms of the urban battle, the Ukrainians are obviously preparing for it. Fighting in urban warfare, as you've seen in Max's report, is very difficult. It's very close. It's very localized. It's very easy to get flanked, and ultimately it's very slow because you have to clear cities methodically. The issue with the Ukrainians is if they choose to go into urban battles at the start of this offensive, then they might get bogged down. If we've seen the Russians in Bakhmut, so there'll be certain cities that they'll absolutely need to take, but there'll also be certain towns and cities that they will bypass because their objectives might be further down the line and they need to get there with relative speed.
In those eastern areas that Ukraine plans to retake, some residents may be on the side of Russia. How much of a risk will they pose, a security risk for Ukraine, if its forces recapture those areas?
I mean, it's always a risk, and that is exactly why you have to have a very methodical approach. And also it's why that once you take a population center, you need to leave forces behind. And, you know, you have to make an assessment on whether the population is supportive of your own troops or enemy troops. And then that will dictate how many forces you leave behind in those areas. And it's exactly the same issue for the Russians. The issue now is that the fighting has been going on for so long, and those cities that has already been drawn into the conflict, I mean, there are not many of the pre-war population left in those areas. So actually the sort of civilian populace of these towns and cities is probably less of a concern at the moment. The main issue is that all of these areas that they will be fighted over and contested initially, I mean, it's where the infrastructure is, it's where you can sort of pre-position forces to move on and sort of have a stepping stone approach into further enemy territory. And at the moment, as we see from Bakhmut and earlier on last year in Mariupol, I mean, there is nothing left of these cities, which actually devalues them from a military perspective.
Ed, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Ed Arnold, a defense and security analyst at the Royal United Services Institute in London.
Let's bring in Justin Crump now, a military veteran and security expert. He joins us from London. Ukraine moving more into eastern parts. How much of a role will urban warfare play there?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ukraine so far has avoided having to attack an urban area. They've defended, obviously, many. They've never had to go on the attack through one. And as your correspondent just showed, the difficulty of urban environment is extreme, and attacking is always harder than defending in any environment, and very much so in the urban environment. So for Ukraine to liberate what it wants in the east, the cities are involved. Of course, Bakhmut, we've seen. That's sitting on the front lines at the moment. I'm sure Ukraine would love to go as far as to recover Mariupol. Of course, we saw the fighting there a year ago. However, the smart way to do it is actually not to have to fight through and clear every street of a city. It's to invest it, to surround it, to isolate it, and then to be able to effectively control it without having to fight street by street. So that's what Ukraine would most likely want to do, to avoid this sort of costly fighting, if it can do that.
You mentioned Bakhmut, Mariupol. Where are the main flashpoints going to be then?
At the moment, obviously, the front line in the south is much further north than Mariupol. It does run through Bakhmut. And there are sort of further cities north of there, sort of Kupiansk, where the front line is currently in Ukraine's favor. But that is, that's the area within the Donbass that Ukraine's looking at the moment at that sort of eastern end. At the western end, the terrain is more open. The river is the Russian flank to the west. That presents its own problems for doing, obviously, a successful river crossing is a huge task for Ukraine to attack from there. And then in the center of all that, you have what's mostly more open farmland. So I think the good news for Ukraine, at least initially, is there aren't any cities they would have to tackle straight away. But if they were to attack south towards, for example, Crimea, then they do encounter cities there, Melitopol and Tokmak and places like that are currently Russian supply hubs that they'd certainly at least have to surround. And those are very heavily defended, as we've seen from satellite pictures. But beyond that, I mean, we focus on the larger cities, but every small village along the front line has become a sort of fortified area. And even a small village is a huge objective to clear. You may have seen the Russians attacking Volodar, a very small town, really, just a couple of kilometers in extent. And that took 3 Russian battalions to attack, and they lost that attack completely. So that's a huge number of troops, even for a very small urban area. They're very significant to clear, even if you don't just focus on the major cities.
What about these drone attacks on Russian territory? Are they a sign that this counteroffensive has already begun?
I think that we always think of an offensive starting when the tanks go steaming forwards and flying towards the enemy with someone waving a checkered flag almost to say it started. Any offensive starts with what we call shaping operations. So you're assessing the battlefield. You're, in Ukraine's case, trying to reduce Russia's logistics supplies, their ability to move troops around. They're trying to destroy enemy command posts. They're collecting intelligence on the enemy. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? Are the planning assumptions correct? And that's been going on for some time. It's a continuous process. But I think the cross-border incursions, which include these drone operations inside Russia, other distractions inside Russia, and these incursions into Russian territory itself, particularly around Kharkov and further north of that, those areas are, I think, all part of a distraction for the Russians. And it's difficult for the Russian command defending everywhere because to move troops into Russia itself, to increase the security in Russia itself, they've got to take them from the front lines. And they're already spread quite thin for what's a sort of 1,500 kilometer front line. And effectively, it's now becoming a 3,000 kilometer one. And Russia has to work out, do they allow these incursions to continue, distractions, or do they defend the front itself in Ukraine?
Great to get your analysis. Justin Crump, intelligence and security expert. Thanks for being on DW News.
Thank you.